Maris Coralveil. Maris Coralveil had always walked the marble corridors of the Athenaeum with the hush of a man who eared the walls might overhear, until the afternoon a book bound in cobalt leather opened by itself at his feet. The pages fluttered like gills, and instead of words he saw a moving reflection of tomorrow's sunrise, and, more startling, the silhouette of his own hand turning a page he had not yet reached. The volume whispered, "Catalog us, and we will catalog you." In that instant, the dim archive offered him a contract, become the first human librarian the living books would allow to read them aloud. He began at once, knowing instinctively that solitary scholarship would not suffice. From the spiral stacks he coaxed the whispering index cards, tiny paper moths that carried cross-references between heartbeats. He traded his pocket watch for an hour with the cartographer of margins, an elderly atlas whose borders bled into countries that did not yet exist. He bartered 3 memories of his mother's lullabies to the children's annex for a chorus of giggling pop-ups willing to scout ahead. Each evening he returned to the circulation desk to record the alliances he had won, until the desk itself grew an extra drawer to hold the growing catalog of favors. On the first sanctioned reading, Maris chose a slim novella whose spine throbbed like a vein. He read the opening sentence aloud, and the letters leapt into the air, rearranging themselves into a flock of black-winged syllables that spelled his name in 7 languages. Applause rustled from the surrounding shelves. Emboldened, he turned to chapter 2, but the book snapped shut, its pages suddenly blank. The novella had exhausted its narrative on the promise of his voice alone. Without deeper payment, it refused to continue. The taste of success turned to chalk in his mouth. At the midpoint of the moonlit reading room, betrayal arrived wearing the guise of generosity. The Grand Lexicon, a bejeweled tome that claimed to contain every story ever unwritten, offered Maris its final chapter if he would surrender his own memories of the sea. He hesitated. The salt of childhood tides still clung to his tongue. When he declined, the Grand Lexicon laughed, a sound like pages torn in half, and revealed that every word he had ever read aloud had already been copied into its appendix. His voice was no longer his. It was an echo in someone else's binding. The floor tilted, and the library doors locked with the finality of a period. Darkness pooled between the shelves, thick as ink. The books ceased their murmurs, even the index cards fell silent, their wings too heavy with dread. Maris wandered aisles that looped back on themselves, past volumes whose spines now bore his name stamped in gilt. He reached for one and felt the paper pulse beneath his fingers like fevered skin. All the stories he had ever loved now contained versions of him distorted beyond recognition. The air grew dense with unread sentences, and he understood that he would spend eternity as a character in a tale he could no longer control. In the hush before despair calcified, a single book, a modest, cloth-bound journal he had carried as a boy, slipped from his coat pocket. Its pages were still empty, untouched by the library's appetite. Maris opened it, and the silence cracked like ice. Here was a space the Grand Lexicon had not mapped. Scrabbling for a pen, he wrote the first line of his own story. Once, a man let books read him, until he learned to read himself. The words glowed, and the corridors straightened. The locked doors sighed open, because the library could not imprison a narrative that had never been written within its walls. Armed with the journal, Maris returned to the Grand Lexicon. This time he read not aloud but inward, drawing the stolen timbre of his voice back through the hollow spaces in his chest. Each reclaimed syllable loosened the book's jeweled clasps. Index cards swarmed like paper hornets, tearing pages that had imprisoned his memories. The cartographer of margins folded the library's corridors into an origami boat, and the giggling pop-ups set it alight with phosphorescent laughter. Maris stepped onto the burning deck, journal in hand, and the Grand Lexicon collapsed into ash that smelled of salt and open water. Dawn found the Athenaeum diminished but breathing, its shelves reordered around the absence at their center. Maris shelved the cobalt volume in a new wing labeled Unfinished Voyages. He kept the journal, now half filled with ink that smelled of tides. Visitors sometimes asked why the library felt gentler, why the books no longer flinched when opened. He only smiled, touching the place where his heartbeat had returned. In the quiet, he could still hear the rustle of pages, learning the difference between being read and being heard. And every evening, before locking the doors, he wrote one more sentence in the journal, proof that the story, like the sea, was finally his to navigate.